Hi, this is Sandy Sims with SDS Digital and the Accord Sequarallel. This is the first video of the tips and tricks series on how to get the most out of your Sequarallel. This first part is on TRAX bridging. The bridge mask sequencer will make some steps to stay on, not returning to off until a new note that has no bridge in its step. This method parts from the conventional in that one lane's notes could stay on while another turns off, depending on whether or not there's following notes in the bridge off step. In the playlist, you can see TRAX 1 has two groups, one for A and one for B. We'll play around with A first. You can see the three VCOs patched over, and the only MIDI is the drums on TRAX 2. Bridging does nothing on MIDI. Only gate, velocity, CV jack rows. So over to setup in the TRAX editor. Bridging only on the panel can add another level of composition if the MIDI was turned up. At the bottom in setup, it's bridge controls. At 16 steps, the mask aligns with the 16-step sequence, so the first step is always bridged. As I add more bridging, you can hear some notes sticking on, while others not. The green LEDs indicate which lanes are bridging. Only another note in the same lane can turn off a bridged note, as long as it isn't also bridged. Lane 3 has very few notes, so the bridging lasts more steps than the others. Changing the bridge sequencer's size steps up the possibilities. It's almost hard to follow, but sounds cool all the same. This could be predictable by dividing the number of steps or using sizes like 6 or 12, so they realign fairly quickly. When the size is changed, the mask map will realign to start fresh, which is useful if you want it to align to step-for-step activity again. So back in the playlist, there's a second group with TRAX 1B and different drums. This could be armed here from the leftmost column, but I'll use jump to groups instead to demonstrate that. Editing this TRAX 1B, let's try bridging here. The bridge on every fourth step is barely noticeable because there's a fair amount of release on the VCO1's ADSR. But adding more, you can hear the difference. Momentary high notes are bridging. every note in lane 1 has a note effects applied. This is to demonstrate the random bridging option. The 1 to 8 setting is probability with this. Thinning out the note effects mask will make it more intermittent. Sometimes you may want to map drums from a MIDI recording that are unknown, or not the standard. I had purposely made a track sequence a while back, using microarp offsets in note effects to bring up percussions that I generally don't use. As you can see, not one drum playing is in the default mapping. First, make sure your source is correct. Yep, MIDI out, channel 10. This is how you can find them. Once in drum mode, in the main screen the left side turns into a 12 drum grid, as each corresponding jack outputs drum triggers. Selecting and scrolling one of these will assign the jack a new drum note. This could be done from the drums menu, but here it's an additional visual cue to help with the process on the display. There's the kick sound. Two jacks can use the same drum, by the way. Oh, there it is. It is a bit more time consuming, but eventually we'll get them all. I've sped this part up to shorten the length of this video. Success. One nifty trick in the playlist is to use PLFX, aka playlist effects, to arm other blocks in other tracks. This can be a bit hard to wrap your head around if more than just 1 or 2 armings. Each track has up to 7 PLFX bundles that can be used by any of the blocks on that track. Each of these can change 4 parameters. As you saw, I have 4 TRAX trackers set up, and in the playlist, the latter 3 are being held by conditional blocks. One triggers the next to start, and a combination of tracks 1 and 2 satisfies a conditional on tracks 4, releasing it to play, similar to this diagram. The other conditionals will wait indefinitely. To set a PLFX to arm a block, simply select the PLFX number, then an empty spot in the list as usual, which will exit the playlist. Go back into the playlist and double-click the block you want to arm. Scroll up to the Arm quick box, but don't click on it. Just hit the S button instead, which will apply it to the PLFX. This is already covered in a different video. Anyway, watch how the playlist markers progress. You can see blocks getting armed by flashing if there's a moment before they play. The last block in tracks 4 has a PLFX do a jump to the second group. Tracks 1 to 3 will eventually arm back into the upper group, but the last block in tracks 4 does another jump to, but group 1. So they're all reset into the conditionals no matter where they were. Here's PLFX 1 in tracks 2, arms a tracks 3 block. PLFX 1 in tracks 3 arms both 1 and 2. This appears rather chaotic to start, but if the blocks are different sequences, just by adding some PLFX arms, the whole thing can become self-aware. Well, maybe not, but pretty interesting to say the least. PLFX can of course control most parameters in the Sequarallel along with hopping around in the playlist, but keep in mind that if a block's PLFX causes an arm to a block in the same track, the PLFX block won't play, because it hops to the armed one first. In the tracks editor, to be used with the fill function, is skip. When a fill range is set, skip will only highlight every nth step from the row selected. Here's an example. First I'll set the note effects to chop the notes into 2, so we can hear the difference. Skip is used exclusively with fill, with the exception of a full range shift. So let's edit note effects assignments in bulk. Every second step's note effects is removed. Or assigned another note effect. Now every third. every fourth, any of the displayable modifiers can be manipulated this way, like level, length, or delay, with randomization if you like. Notes themselves can be selectively changed this way as well, even with scales and randomization applied, but I'll let you experiment with those ones. With the Sequarallel, it's possible to record notes created by changes in a CV input or gate input plus CV inputs. In this example, there will be no gate, just CV variation creating notes. An LFO is patched into CC5 jack, which is set as an input with the function of MIDI notes. Delta, or variation, causes the trigger once it passes a threshold in a certain amount of time. The actual CV voltage is used to quantize into note numbers, which is then converted to MIDI. This MIDI is merged with the panel MIDI in routing with the merge option on, and in turn gets recorded as a layer, which can then have effects mods applied. So first we'll define the function of the CC5 jack in MIDI push. Up to 3 jacks can make MIDI notes, or 2 with 1 gate, or just 1 with 1 gate. With an LFO, it's more haphazard to use no gate. As MIDI notes are triggered by variance, any little voltage surge in the rack can trigger a note, which is a downside to this method. But for our purposes and a constantly changing LFO, it will be fine. This was my finger touching the tip. If the rate of change is too slow in comparison to the clock rate, notes won't be triggered. Now to turn up the attenuator. Just random notes, as expected. With the CV2MIDI notes, there's a special setting that will allow SongFX to directly transpose and scale the input. I'll enable those. Now to set them up in the only song loops SongFX. This isn't really needed, as once the notes have been recorded, they can be quantized to scales, transposed, limited, and have a whole load of other modifiers applied. I just want it to sound better for the video. Okay, maybe an odd scale of unknown origin. This scale could also be applied to layers from here, post-record. Now to add a layer quick box to record to. And it's a good idea to set record to one shot so there's only one layer recorded. It could be more, but at this density of notes I don't think that would be good. Take it up to record 8 bars. So layer is armed and we'll hit the play button to record and play the notes after. Okay, so it's playing. I'll unplug from the LFO. The first thing I think of to do here is quantize the notes to the clock. Many notes are paired together on the 1/8 measure, as the recorded notes were pretty much twice as fast. Mirror could be applied, but let's limit out some of those really low notes first. Transpose will raise them all up. All offset from F, which matters with the scale, which is done after the transpose. Mirror can be applied to change the notes all around. So song loop effects are a go-to method for scaling and transposing random notes, as there can be up to 17 different song effects to use in the playlist. Thus, 17 different scale and transpose combinations. There are 2 song effects that can be applied across the board, scale and transpose. The Apply To option must be enabled for each though. Other song effects like Note Length Attenuator won't apply to layers unless they opt in from their side in the layer bar step sequencer. So retriggering on, use song effects on. Mirror seems to be generating some rogue notes, so we'll have to take care of that shortly. Back to song effects. Longer note lengths are actually better with retriggering, because they won't retrigger unless they're still on. The level only is for MIDI velocities. Unless there's VCAs from the velocity jacks, the VCOs won't change. Now into the song effects subsequencer. Retrigger isn't noticeable because it's also at 1/8. Now it is. Note lengths on unmasked subsequencer steps. Oh, the ADSR release is turned up on that VCO. Note limit here is only going upward, so cuts the highs. If we end up mirroring the song effects. As I mentioned, only the MIDI velocities will be lowered on masked steps. Changing the subsequencer size will cause some different cadences to the notes. FX Move will shift the subsequencer in ticks of a quarter note, thus the masking and retriggering also get shifted. Now to do a transpose of the whole thing. This is additive, so it still uses our +5 transpose set in the layer quit box earlier. 5 + 6 equals total transpose to B. Adding a couple of bar steps without settings will revert to the original before the song effects once stepped into. But in the third step, I'll add yet more transpose, making it D. Plus use the song effects and change away from the VCO channel 1. As you can see, a random string of notes can be made into something coherent. By the way, song effect scales always take over layer, or track scales. This way a non-scale from a song effects number will fall back to their originals. This final part of the video uses the same CC5 patch to get CV2MIDI notes, but there's also CC6 CV2MIDI notes added. This is an experimental feature to record into tracks from CV, as we did in Layers, that will be included in version 1.7 if it pans out okay. The difference with TRAX is that it will overwrite steps with new notes, and if the TRAX record options of stack or cycle are assigned, then the notes would fill the grid the same way as in the TRAX record video. Only notes happening will overwrite previous notes. In the options, I'll set the note lengths a bit shorter so it sounds more clear. As with Layers, effects options can be added, but the original notes will not be heard once recording, only the resulting notes in the grid. There's a sequence quantized by default with the steps. Patching a rhythm to CC6 can pile on lots of notes, but they're erased on the following pass. The rhythm, not in clock sync, keeps sending the CV though. Let's get this sounding nicer. I don't know about you, but random notes isn't really my thing. The scale and transpose is applied to the CV2 notes input, not TRAX itself, although it could be without change. I'm unplugging both CC5 and CC6 to let TRAX play the new sequence. Plugging CC5 back in intermittently changes the sequence, of course, as we're still in record. If more than one CV2MIDI note comes in during a step, the notes will stack up in lanes 2 and 3, etc. Changing the swing setting will also change how the notes are recorded as well, because the record timing will also change. I hope you have enjoyed this tips and tricks video and that it maybe gave you some ideas on new ways to use the Sequarallel. I'm Sandy Sims. Keep on patching!